So Texas just sued the ATF, arguing that the ATF has no authority to regulate suppressors that are made and sold in Texas under the new Texas suppressor law. So let's talk about this. But real quick before we jump into this video, if you think the ATF needs to be abolished, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. So like I said in the intro, the state of Texas is now suing the ATF to prevent them from being able to regulate firearms suppressors that are made in Texas. This lawsuit arises out of Texas House Bill 957, which passed last year. HB 957 aimed to exempt from federal regulation all suppressors that are made in and remain in Texas. HB 957 exempted silencers which are manufactured in Texas and which remain in Texas, and exempts them from federal firearms laws and regulations, including federal registration requirements under the NFA. This law requires that these suppressors be stamped made in Texas, and it also bars all local agencies and entities and law enforcement agencies from enforcing inconsistent federal laws against Texas residents who actually are in possession of these made in Texas suppressors. The claim behind the Texas suppressor law is that since these items are made and sold in the state of Texas, they do not fall under interstate commerce and therefore fall outside of the purview of federal regulation by the ATF. Currently, federal law regulates suppressors, making it illegal for someone to own a firearm suppressor for personal use without first paying a tax to the federal government. It is also a federal offense to possess, manufacture, transport, repair, or to sell a suppressor unless a person complies with all of those federal guidelines first. After Texas passed their suppressor law last year, the ATF sent a letter to Texas and all individuals within Texas, essentially threatening that they will enforce the NFA and GCA's regulations against these made in Texas suppressors, and that they will enforce it against anyone who buys, sells, possesses, transports, etc. these made in Texas suppressors. Now, if you want to know more about that letter that the ATF sent, I actually put out a video kind of comprehensively covering the arguments made by the ATF, and it goes a little bit more in depth about what actually the ATF was arguing. So I'll pin that at the end of this video, and that'll be one of the in-screen videos if you want to learn more about that. Now, after the ATF sent out that warning letter, it was essentially Texas's move from there on. Well, we now know that the state of Texas decided to file a lawsuit against the ATF, and it was filed through the state attorney general. And the lawsuit seeks to prevent the ATF from enforcing its federal laws and regulations against the Texas made and sold suppressors. So let's take a look at what they're actually arguing in their lawsuit against the ATF. First, Texas argues heavy federal taxation and regulation of firearm suppressors made in Texas for personal use in Texas does not survive Heller's recognition that the right to keep and bear arms is an individual fundamental right. The enshrinement of constitutional rights necessarily takes certain policy choices off the table. They also argue that federal regulation of firearm suppressors made in Texas for personal use in Texas cannot be justified as regulations of interstate commerce or as laws necessary and proper for the carrying into execution such regulations of interstate commerce. The state of Texas therefore argues that the court should enjoin federal law as applied to taxing and regulating firearm suppressors made in Texas for personal use in Texas because that law violates the Second Amendment. In this section of the complaint, Texas argues that the taxation and regulation of firearm suppressors made in Texas for personal use in Texas do not survive intermediate scrutiny, much less more stringent scrutiny levels, i.e. strict scrutiny review. When it comes to tiers of scrutiny analysis, just understand that there are different levels of analysis that a court could apply to various laws that touch on constitutional rights. And it's, again, kind of tiered. At the top is strict scrutiny, which is the hardest level for a government restriction to pass. Then there's kind of that middle ground, which is intermediate scrutiny. And then at the very bottom and the easiest one for a restriction to pass is rational basis. Under the intermediate scrutiny test, courts ask whether the state's interest in prescribing a regulation are substantial, whether the challenge regulation advances these interests in a direct and material way, and whether the extent of the restriction on the exercise of constitutional right is in reasonable proportion to the interest served. Applying intermediate scrutiny, the government must produce substantial evidence to justify its taxation and regulation of firearm suppressors built in Texas for personal use in Texas. The state of Texas argues that the ATF cannot do so. They also point out that raising revenue is not a sufficient justification for specifically taxing the exercise of a constitutional right. The state of Texas also points out that the government's burden is not satisfied by mere speculation or conjecture. Instead, the ATF must demonstrate that the harms it recites are real and that the restrictions will in fact alleviate them. So since the ATF claims these items, i.e. suppressors, are dangerous and cause harm, they must demonstrate through real evidence that they are dangerous and that they cause harm. And they must also prove that the tax that they are levying on them and the regulations they are levying on them will actually alleviate those harms. So they can't just simply rely on conjecture, just say, well, we think that they cause harm and we think that a tax on them will resolve this. They have to show actual evidence because, again, this is a constitutional right that they are impacting. And lastly, in this section, Texas points out the fact that there are no other examples of direct federal taxes on the exercise of constitutional rights. But for whatever reason, the ATF gets away with a taxation on suppressors, which do fall within our right to keep and bear arms under the Second Amendment. Finally, Texas argues in their second count of the complaint that the court should grant a declaratory judgment that neither the Commerce Clause nor the Necessary and Proper Clause allowed the federal regulation of making of suppressors for personal use in Texas. Texas argues that the federal government may not regulate intrastate commerce, i.e. commerce that only happens within a specific state, or non-commerce, such as the making of firearm suppressors in Texas that will remain in Texas under the Commerce Clause. Texas goes on to state that activities that substantially affect interstate commerce, i.e. commerce that goes from state to state crossing borders, are not themselves part of interstate commerce, and thus the power to regulate them cannot come from the Commerce Clause alone. Rather, Congress's regulatory authority over intrastate activities that are not themselves part of interstate commerce, including activities that have a substantial effect on interstate commerce, derives from the Necessary and Proper Clause. However, Texas argues that since the making of a firearm suppressor in Texas that will only be used for home defense in Texas cannot be regulated under either the Commerce Clause or the Necessary and Proper Clause, which the ATF is claiming that they can do. So this is an interesting lawsuit because it involves both Second Amendment issues, but also the ability of the federal government to tax a constitutional right and also their ability to regulate a constitutional right which is purely exercised exclusively intrastate or only within a specific state. It does not cross borders. The way HB 957 was written also allows the Texas AG to sue the ATF once a Texas resident said that he or she wanted to make a suppressor within the state under the new law, and that is why you now see this lawsuit popping up. Another thing I would like to note is that if I were in Texas, if I were someone residing within Texas, this whole suppressor issue, I would not actually engage in any of these activities until this case was actually resolved, especially taking into light the high risk that the ATF has now indicated through the letter that they will prosecute people who try to do this under this new Texas law. Just in my opinion, would be a better idea to wait to see this play out because we've seen with other states who've tried similar laws and bills, the ATF has been very aggressive in prosecuting people, and it's just better to kind of let this run its course, let the case run its course, and hopefully the state of Texas will win against the ATF, and then made in Texas suppressors will be the new kind of rant and rave and thing that's going on in Texas, and that would be a huge win for the state of Texas, but other states as well who want to engage in this type of activity without a general just tyrannical agency trying to stop and regulate these types of actions. But like I said, if you want to learn more about the ATF letter that is threatening prosecution for these types of activities, like I said, I will pin a video at the end that goes more comprehensively into that letter that was sent by the ATF to the state of Texas and all of the residents. If you have any questions, go ahead and comment down below and I'll try to answer the best of my ability. Also, if you like this video and like support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is to like, comment, and subscribe. All those things help to fuel the algorithm or fuel Algore's rhythm. It adds fuel to his jet and it signals to YouTube that you guys see value in these videos and in this type of 2A news. Again, I cannot thank you guys enough for everybody who likes, comments, subscribes, who hits the notification bell, especially for those of you who hit the notification bell and then enable all notifications. That is the best way to make sure you're actually getting access to my videos. If you click all notifications, it ensures that YouTube will actually send out all of the videos that I put out to you directly. But regardless, thank you guys for all of your support. And as always, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars. This nation will be maintained by armed scholars.